Hello, this training is just a basic training about better understanding autism. One of my favorite quotes is if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism. So remember, even though I'm going to talk about common characteristics and deficits and strengths that you might see in individuals with autism, remembering that each person is unique and they are their own person. And so maybe something that you've done with a child or somebody before with autism worked, but that doesn't mean that's always going to work for every child or every individual who has autism. So what is autism? Autism is a spectrum disorder. So meaning that, there's one end of the spectrum and there's the other end of the spectrum, and there's all kinds of different characteristics in between. Okay, so you might work with an individual who doesn't have much language to somebody who has lots of language. Maybe somebody who has high cognitive skills and who has challenges with cognitive skills. So it's a spectrum. A very important piece of autism is to know that autism is a brain-based developmental disorder. Okay, it's not a mental illness. It's not a result of anything that we know of in the environment. It is brain-based. So individuals with autism, the research shows that their brains work differently. It is lifelong. So if an individual is identified with autism, they will have those autism forever. Not that they can't learn and they can't develop a lot of great skills and have a very happy life, but those core characteristics of autism will impact them throughout their life. It is evident during the first 3 years of life, so we can detect autism in children who are really young. They're even looking at now some research looking at even 6-month-olds. So that because we know that the earlier that we can detect autism, the quicker that we can start teaching those skills that they have trouble with, and that the better prognosis long term. And as I said earlier, since it's a spectrum disorder, symptoms range from mild to severe. Right now, the prevalence is 1 in 6 children have just a general developmental disability. 1 in 59 individuals have a diagnosis of autism. So this was a new CDC number that came out just within the last couple weeks. It's distributed throughout the world in all races, nationalities, and social classes. So it's more common than pediatric cancer, diabetes, and AIDS combined. Okay. And people wonder why the increase. There's an increased awareness. So now everybody knows about autism. There's more pediatricians now that are screening for autism at different ages and stages. So there's more screening tools just available for everybody online. There's changes in how autism is defined. So a couple years ago, they changed and they made instead of having like Asperger's, PDD-NOS, autism, they just have an autism now. So, and then they have different levels of autism within that one spectrum. So they changed in how that was defined, meaning some people, who maybe weren't qualified before would, and vice versa. However, it still does not account for all of the increase. So what the research is telling us that this increase is probably due to a combination of genes, biology, and environment. So when you look at genetics, it's 4 to 5 times more likely in boys. 1 in 10 individuals with autism also have another type of genetic or chromosomal disorder, which tells us even more that there's a genetic component. If a sibling, parent, or relative with autism is at higher risk for having a child with autism. So if you have one child with autism, you're at higher risk for having another. Higher risk if the twin has a diagnosis of autism. So all these things here that I outlined show us that there is a genetic component to autism. It's just we haven't narrowed down for sure what that gene is. Also looking at biology environment, so the research says there's a link between a higher risk of autism and certain pregnancy, or certain prescription drugs taken during pregnancy, so valproic acid and thalidomide, I can't say that, and then a small percentage higher in children born premature or low birth weight. So these are some biology environment factors that we see as an increase for having a diagnosis of autism. So what does this tell us? It tells us that it truly takes a village, that we all need to know about autism, because if you haven't worked with an individual with autism, you might have a friend who has a child with autism, or a family member, or just being in the community. We're going to see more people with autism in the community. And so we all need to know how to support people who learn differently. And so, this training is really important for everybody. So according to the new DSM, and the DSM is the guide that gives us a diagnosis, essentially for anything that we can't do blood work on. The two core areas that we look at when diagnosing autism are social reciprocity communication and then restricted repetitive stereotype behavior. So I'm going to give you some examples of both of those. So social reciprocity is really that ability to interact and understand social relationships, social cues. And so what you might see in individuals with autism, and this is just a general idea, is poor eye contact. So maybe, a lot of kids won't make any eye contact, or some might learn how to make eye contact and they just stare at you. Eye contact is very social, so that can be very difficult and overwhelming for some individuals with autism. You might see a limited range of facial expressions. And so one important thing I want you to remember is that it's not that individuals with autism don't have feelings, and I've heard this from many people with autism. It's that they don't know how to match their facial expressions and their body language to how they're feeling. So individuals with autism, some of them will be the most compassionate people that you will meet and sensitive, but they just don't know how to match those facial expressions. So you might just see a very, not changing a facial expression. So it might look the same if they're happy, if they're sad, if they're mad. Failure to develop peer relationships, so difficulty really understanding the give and take of relationships. A lot of individuals with autism, had difficulty seeing things from anybody else's perspective. And so them knowing how to have conversations with people about other things that people are interested in might be difficult. Failure to share enjoyment with others. So this is something that we look at when kids are really young, is, if they see something that they like, or if they're enjoying something, do they share that enjoyment with other people around them? Or do they just enjoy it themselves? So a little child, you give them a fun toy to play with. The first thing they do is they play with the fun toy and they look at mom, they look at dad to share in that enjoyment. So we might not see this in individuals with autism. And then just that overall lack of social reciprocity, so the give and take of social relationships. Language and communication. So you might see delayed or atypical language development. So you might see them not talking for a while, or you might see, I've had people say, their kids too, and they're like, oh, he already can spell the planets. And so that's atypical language development. He could spell the planets, but however, he couldn't ask mom or dad for juice or milk. Difficulty initiating or sustaining conversation. So not knowing how to go up to somebody and say, hey, how are you doing today? Initiating that conversation, or how to sustain a conversation. So they might be able to ask one question, but they aren't able to ask follow-up questions in a conversation. And so then you also having that stereotype repetitive use of language. I had a little girl I used to work with who anytime she needed something, she would say, backpack, backpack. Well, she watched a lot of Dora, and that's how she communicated that she needed help, because anytime Dora needed help, she used her backpack. You also might see a lack of pretend play, so not having the ability to, go in the home living area or the cars area or the Legos area and do pretend play. That can be really hard for them. So the other ones, we have the social reciprocity, social communication, and then we have the second area is this restricted repetitive stereotype behavior. Okay, so you might have individuals who have those circumscribed interests. So they have something that they want to they're interested in all the time. And it's not something that they just like, it's something that really takes over their brain. And that's the only thing that they can think about. And so we have to really find ways to use those interests as either rewards, or we have to figure out how to shift those interests to other things if we can. You might have one that's rigid adherence to rituals and routines. And rituals and routines that might not make sense to us, but they have to do the same thing over and over again the same way. So that's why it's always important when I'm talking to teachers and parents that, if you have a certain way you want things done, teach them the right way from the beginning. Because once they develop a routine or a ritual around an activity, it's really hard to break that. So teach them the right way ahead of time in the beginning. Stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms. So you might see this is kind of that self-stimming type behaviors where you might see they're fluttering their fingers in front of their eyes, or they're rocking back and forth. And then the preoccupation with parts of objects versus the whole object. So common thing we'll see in young kids is they might just spin the wheel on the car versus playing with the car, like going over the tracks and all this. It's preoccupation with the small parts. So once again, we have two core deficit areas. We have social communication as one, so you'll see deficits in that area, and then you'll also see this restricted repetitive stereotype behavior. So they have to meet criteria in both of those categories to have a diagnosis of autism. One important thing I want you to think about is, I love this quote, is that there's no single behavior that is always typical of autism, and no behavior that would automatically exclude an individual child from having a diagnosis of autism. So it's not just one thing that you say, oh, they do that, they have autism, or they don't do that, they have autism. An example of, I have a friend who has a little girl that goes to daycare, and she does not have autism, but one day I was over at their house, and she was lining up all of her baby dolls. And he said, oh my gosh, Tara, what's going on? Do you think she has autism? Because she's lining up things in a row. And I'm like, no, no, she is just imitating what she saw in her daycare. So that one thing is not going to say, yes, she has autism. You really look at the quality of all the different behaviors and interactions to diagnose autism. Okay, and so once again, like I said in the beginning, that every child is unique. Okay, these are the core deficits that we use to diagnose autism, and to understand kind of their learning styles, but we really need to find out what their strengths are, what things they like to do, and use those to really create plans and teach them those skills that are harder for them. So thank you, and have a great day.